Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for joining me tonight for another fabulous story, because nothing in this world beats a good story. And don't forget to share this video with anybody else who might be interested. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up, me and my brother Winston had no memory of my mother, but I knew how she died. The enigmatic, fortuitous events over her death were shrouded in mystery, hidden behind a grey cloud of obscurity, which was like a foggy haze that hung inauspiciously over our lives, that invited for us a plethora of questions that were never actually answered for us. When me or my brother Winston tried to talk about my mother, my father would quite literally clam up like an oyster in a shell. His hands would tremble, his face would grow ashen. He'd suddenly become very subdued and sombre. The gloomy, tenebrific atmosphere around the dinner table would suddenly become so quiet, and all we could hear was the tick-tock-tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Everyone would stop eating. 2 pairs of inquisitive eyes would be pinned on my dad, as we waited in expectation to hear what he had to say. It would make me and my brother feel exceptionally guilty that we had dared broach the sensitive subject of my mother's death to my dad. But we had no memories of her, and wanted to know all about her. My father's words were always the same, barely ever wavering in their context. He would shuffle awkwardly in the chair, rub a hand under his morning stubble, gaze longingly into the distance, as if his thoughts were 100 miles away, and he would say, "Your mother was a very beautiful woman. I miss her dreadfully. She loved the both of you very much. It was a tragedy what happened to her, but some things that happen are beyond our control."
"But what happened to her, Daddy?" I would ask. You told us that she was died. You told us it was on the cruise liner, but you never told us exactly what happened."
"Well, there is nothing to tell, son," my father would insist. "We were on a cruise liner, as I told you. I retired to bed early one night. I had a very bad stomach. I'd eaten some seafood for dinner. It had turned my guts into liquid. Your mother drank a great deal of alcohol that night, was ever so slightly intoxicated. She told me she was going to have a late-night midnight snack on the cruise liner because she was hungry. She'd worked up an appetite for herself because she'd drunk so much. The cruise liner would have a buffet for their guests at midnight. She begged me to join her. She did not want to be dining on her own. I did feel annoyed about this because I wasn't feeling great, but I humoured her. After she had enjoyed some blue cheese, biscuits, grapes, and all kinds of other goodies, she then insisted on going for a walk on the deck for some fresh air. I accompanied her for a short while, but left her to her own devices. I needed to return to the cabin. My guts had turned to liquid again. I did wake up the following morning to find your mother was not in the cabin. I looked for her everywhere, searching the gym, the breakfast area, the shops on board the ship. And when she could not be found, I naturally sounded the alarm. A search was conducted for your mother on board the ship, but she was nowhere to be found. A shoe was found under one of the railings that overlooked the ocean. The shoe belonged to your mother. Her body was never recovered. It was presumed she was in a drunken state and had climbed over the railings. Your mother was quite the gymnast and always did things like that. She must have fallen to her death in the water, lost her footing, and it was gleamed that it was a dreadful tragedy that she had drowned. When I returned home, everyone was devastated to hear the bad news about what had happened to your mother. But as we had no body, we could only have a memorial service for her."
"So she's still out there, in the ocean, all on her own, with the fishes?"
"I'm afraid so, son. But she's no longer in the ocean. Her body is there, but her spirit is in heaven with Jesus. I assure you, She's looking down on us and smiling from heaven."
"You really think so, Daddy? You think she watches over us?"
"Yes, of course I do."
Soon after my mother's tragic sudden passing, my dad left our bungalow in Southern California, where we'd been living, and bought an exquisite stylish-looking cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains to embrace a brand new beginning for our small family of 3. I think he felt he'd heal better from losing my mother if we moved to pastures green, and he felt moving to the mountains would kickstart our lives in a more positive, upbeat direction. The cabin was masterfully built on a high elevation by a skilled architect who loved building perfect mountain homes for an illustrious upmarket clientele who were eager to buy a second, rather opulent home in the mountains for their holiday adventures. Our home was our permanent residence. The cabin boasted exquisite panoramic views over the mountains that would smudge the skyline audaciously in undulating curvaceous folds of blues and greys that sometimes were mysteriously shrouded in a white veil of mist that would give them an ethereal silvery quality. In truth, the cabin looked more like a luxurious Swiss chalet than just your bog-standard cabin. It boasted large sheer glass windows on both the ground and upper stories of the cabin. My father was a woodcarver by trade. He made a living for himself as also a carpenter that produced handmade stuff that would be transported to New York and Los Angeles to be sold for extortionate amounts of money for a rich clientele who desired handmade kitchen cabinets and ornate hand-carved doors. My father began carving doors after a visit to Morocco, where many of the doors there are very ornate. So my father returned to America with grand ideas to make similar doors and maximized his carving skills, which were all self-taught. Some of my father's stuff was shipped abroad, and even the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia bought some of his doors for his palace because they were so beautiful. My father was brilliant at carving, and some of the doors he made were masterpieces, so he was receiving orders from all over North America, and he was not afraid to put on a high price tag on his creations. My father always used to say, one should never be afraid to charge, because one should always know one's worth, which is a lesson I learnt early on in my life. I considered myself remarkably privileged to grow up in an idyllic part of the world, but I so wished for a female role model in our lives, and was exceedingly hopeful that my father would marry again, after my mother's fortuitous tragic demise. But I found him to be rather suspicious of women. On one occasion he began to date a lovely woman called Ivy, with a sparkling personality. I'm not sure what her surname actually was. She was of Italian ancestry and had olive skin, dark eyes, and lots of hair that was naturally very crinkly. Me and my brother Winston would sit up at night, hoping that my dad would pop the question to this charming young lady, and finally marry her, so that we would have a stepmother for ourselves. My father never committed to anyone, and when I would challenge him about it and tell him how much I'd love a mother, as all the boys and girls at the school I attended had mothers, I sensed I was really missing out, for I envied how the mothers fussed over their children, and if their kid left their lunchbox at home, the mother would return to school at once, so the child never went hungry. When I left my lunchbox at home, it never even crossed my father's mind to drop it off at the school, as he didn't think like a woman did, so I would usually just go hungry. Suffice to say, when me or Winston broached the subject of how we would love a mother, he'd say to me, "Son, be careful for what you wish for. When I was a boy, my mother treated me like the scum of the earth. Would you like a stepmother to treat you like that?"
"Of course I wouldn't, Daddy, but Ivy—"
"No buts, son. My mother loathed me, and my sister. She was verbally abusive towards the both of us. In the end, she willingly gave my father custody over us, and sauntered off into the sunset to spend the rest of her life all on her own. We never heard from her again. My mother was full of herself, conceited, arrogant, vain, self-centred, extremely selfish. She was a beautiful woman who spent a fortune on her appearance. Indeed, she only cared about what she looked like. Nothing else mattered to her. If she had invested in us like she invested in her physical appearance, we might have had a halfway decent childhood. She was shallow and fake. All these years later, I have no idea whether she's dead or alive, and frankly, I don't give a damn. She didn't give a damn about us. Never once in our lives did she stop to consider the children she had birthed. We never even received a postcard, a letter, a birthday card, or a parcel from her. That's how insouciant and apathetic she was towards us. There was a rumour that she got married to a very wealthy man, and had gone under the knife several times, with breasts so large they would probably sink the Titanic. Let's just say it cut us to the bone. It broke our little hearts into shreds. As a young boy, I asked my father,
"What is wrong with us, Daddy? Why does Mama not want anything to do with us? Does she not love us any more?"
My father reminded us how cruel she had been towards us when she had been around, how often she'd called us the noose around her neck, how she'd shrieked at us like a banshee, calling us little brats, how she'd locked us up in our bedrooms when she wanted to go out on the town. She was desirous to make sure we did not leave our bedrooms, while she got up to all kinds of shenanigans. We were quick to forget the bad things she had done, and beyond that she cheated on my father on numerous occasions, without even batting an eyelid. He forgave her every time. My father was a soft touch, for her self-indulgent, very vulgar behaviour. He'd say to me, "Be glad she's gone, son." I know I've never been more relieved to see the back of her myself. That's what he said to me. The woman drove a pickaxe through my heart, and it ain't going to happen to me again. I'm afraid, son, some women can have a dark side. I didn't know what my father meant back then, until I married your mother years later, and my own father warned me about her. "I don't like her, son," he told me. "There's something not right about her, something about her that gives me the creeps, but I can't put a finger on it. On the surface she seems so nice, but I don't like it when her eyes change colour." I didn't know what my father was talking about. I wish I'd paid attention to his sagacious advice. But I thought your mother was the most beautiful butterfly to enter my life. But sometimes that woman, she morphed into a caterpillar. Believe me, it wasn't pretty at all. What do caterpillars do, son? They eat up all the good stuff, don't they? Until there's nothing left at all.
"You mean Mama had a dark side, Dad?"
I asked incredulously, for up to that point I had distinctly believed that my mother had been the quintessential queen bee. I could tell my father deeply regretted having spilled the truth out of his mouth about my mother. He'd tell us it wasn't good to speak ill of the dead, but we were to glean from him that my mother was not just sugar and spice and all things nice, and that there had been a less than agreeable side to her character.
I wish I could tell you, son, what you want to hear, that your mother was as bright as a sunny day. But everyone knows the weather can be inclined to become stormy and overcast at times. Your mother could grow dark at times, as she
what, Dad?
Never mind, son, about all the details. The less you know, the better. Yes, there was a dark side to her character, if you can call it that. But let's not dwell on that now, shall we? You know, son, when you marry someone, you're investing in that person for life. Don't you ever forget that for a moment. Always remember they're showing you their best side. It's like buying something to last you for a lifetime. But sometimes you don't always read the fine print. Women are much more complicated than men. They'll often beguile you with their appearance, so you can be taken in by their good looks. What you see, my son, is not what you always get. How many times have you bought an attractive-looking candy bar at the shops? But when you ate it, it wasn't half as good as it looked on the outside. That's what it can be like with some women.
"But, Dad, you're wrong," I insisted, not finding what my dad was saying at all heartening. Surely not all women were like that.
When I'm at the school gates, I see many really nice mummies coming to pick up their kids from school. They don't look horrible.
You think they're nice, son, because that's all you see. And to be fair to them, maybe they genuinely are very nice. But it doesn't mean they all are behind closed doors. Not every apple in the cart is good. You would do well to remember that. Unfortunately, son, I am one of those people that has a penchant for picking out the bad apples. I probably take after my father in that regard. If I'm wrong about all this, then tell me, son, why are there so many divorces? People choosing to go their separate ways in relationships. It's because people discover things about each other that they don't like. One day when you get married, son, you need to be very sagacious about who you choose to spend your life with. Make bloody sure you're not seduced by just a pretty face. That is the oldest trick in the book. You learn about it in the Bible, don't you? The seductress that seduces you in her bed, draped with fine linens and beautiful perfumes, that ensnares you in her trap while her husband's away. What does it say in the holy book? She'll take you down to the grave, my son.
I remember my father's words hit me hard. Did he mean that when many of the mothers returned home from school, they'd shape-shift into monsters? Granted, my father had a tough childhood with a mother who'd abandoned him. No wonder he was so cynical. Then he'd married my mother, and had seen a dark side to her character. It would seem he had been unlucky in love, but I didn't think all women were like that. Based on all the cheerful-looking photographs I'd seen of my mother over the years and the photograph albums I'd looked at, she had looked such a benevolent, kind woman. But there was one photograph in that book that gave me pause for thought. In this photograph my mother is standing right next to my dad. They're both lovingly holding each other's hands. But as my mother turns around to look over her shoulders at the cameraman, her eyes look as if they're as black as coal. There is a manic look about her, a depraved expression on her face. When I showed the photograph to my brother Winston, he recoiled in disgust, for the woman in the picture did not look like my mother. It sent shivers down my spine.
"Why do you think her eyes are so black in this photograph?" I asked my brother. "Do you think the camera must have been faulty or something?"
My brother shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly.
"I don't know, but those eyes are very, very scary. She looks like a devil in that picture."
I showed the picture to my dad. He looked very sorrowful.
I told you, there was a dark side to your mother. You can see it in the photograph. That's what I sometimes encountered with her.
"But Ivy, she's not like that. Her eyes don't grow black, Daddy. I don't think she has a dark side, like you claim our mother did. Ivy's so nice, and she likes you a lot, and she's always bringing us presents, Daddy."
Ivy is buying your affection, son. It's the oldest trick in the book. People can pretend to be nice. You hear about it in church enough. It's known as being a wolf in sheep's clothing.
"So then you're not going to marry Ivy?"
"Ivy's a very sweet lady, son. But no, I shall not be marrying her. I've been there, done that, and I ain't going to fall for that again. I'm happy with the things the way they are. If Ivy wants a man to commit to her long term, it ain't going to be me. I'm never going to get married again. I am going to remain single."
Growing up, my dad definitely severed my view of relationships, and that picture of my mother with the black eyes haunted me throughout my childhood. How was it possible for a pretty pair of blue eyes to go black? And what about the manic, menacious expression on her face that looked so vindictive, so spiteful, so malevolent? I knew the camera had not been lying. So why had my mother looked like a woman possessed? The picture freaked the hell out of me, and I could never get it out of my mind. In my case, the prettier a woman was, the more suspicious I became of her. And if she showed any tendencies of being vain or conceited, such as obsessing over her appearance, I would run for the hills. No, no, no! I did not want a girl like that. One day I met a very nice girl at the university campus in Boston, and I fell for her hook, line and sinker. Try as I might not to allow this to happen, I became putty in her hands. She had unequivocally stolen my heart, and I knew she was the one for me. I brought her home to the Blue Ridge Mountains to stay the weekend at our cabin, to meet my father and my brother Winston. I was naturally reluctant for Claudia to meet my dad, and warned her about his natural cynicism towards women. I told her about the photograph of my mother with the black eyes, and about how my father's mother had abandoned him as a child.
"Your poor father," said Claudia. "I do feel for him. You do know our experiences shape us into who we become. Given your father had such unfortunate experiences with his mother growing up, and then issues with his own wife, no wonder he's a perennial cynic, and very scathingly sceptical over relationships. Don't you dare judge him for that. If I was wearing his boots, I'd likely feel exactly the same way about women." Claudia was doing psychology at university, and had made an intense study into human behaviour.
"I have to say, Claudia, I didn't believe my dad for a long time when he talked about my mother having a dark side. But when I saw that photograph, I shivered in my recall. It was the most horrifying picture I have ever beheld. It was demoniacal. I wanted to believe the camera had caught her at a bad angle, and it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't that. She looked as if her eyes were possessed by something very evil."
Claudia had held my arm and given it an encouraging squeeze.
"You never knew your mother. How can you possibly know what she was like? You don't know if the camera wasn't a bit dodgy that day. It could have been an unfortunate picture. But if your father said your mother had a dark side, well, then maybe she did. He would know. You never knew her. So don't jump to conclusions about her. How did she die?"
"It was an accident on an ocean liner. She was drunk as a skunk at the time, slipped over the railings into the water late at night and drowned. No one witnessed the grievous incident, but the crew surmise that that is what happened. Her shoe was found ensnared in the railings. She was, in fact, a gymnast, I believe, when she was young, always attempting to climb things."
Claudia raised a brow.
"What a way to die! I can't imagine climbing up the railings when you're drunk, even if you are a gymnast. You're literally tempting fate, because you're not going to be stable on your feet, are you? Imagine the helplessness of finding yourself splashing around in a dark ocean and no one hearing your cries for help. Good job she was so inebriated, that's what I say. I think her death would have been relatively painless. The alcohol would have anaesthetized her to an extent, so would likely have been a quick death."
"You think so?"
I asked, looking relieved.
"Yes, I do actually," Claudia had said. "Sometimes when people are drunk, they have no real concept of what's going on around them. Haven't you noticed that before?"
Claudia, my girlfriend, looked like the girl next door. She was down to earth, a young woman that was intelligent, sharp and astute. With bird-like eyes, she was fresh-faced and quite charming, and there was nothing remotely self-centered about her. She wore her heart on her sleeve, and most people warmed to her at once. But my father's reaction to her was very upsetting, but I shouldn't have expected anything else. But to give credit to Claudia, she held her own, and didn't allow my father's brusque, invasive questions to knock her off her perch.
"Dad, I want to introduce you to Claudia,"
I said, bringing my girlfriend into the cabin. My father had been expecting us for lunch, and the scowl on his face was less than friendly. Could he not just be a little bit more congenial towards my girlfriend, I thought. His eyes narrowed suspiciously as they swept over Claudia.
"It's so lovely to meet you, Mr. Ferris. I've heard all about you from Harris."
"You have you?" said my father. "All good, I hope,"
he said, without even a flicker of humour on his pursed lips, which was so unlike him.
"As if anything else," said Claudia, rolling her eyes. "Of course, everything he's told me about you is great."
Before long I was seated around the table with my father and my brother Winston, who was thankfully very friendly towards Claudia, making her feel very comfortable.
"It's good to meet you, Claudia. Harris has told me all about you."
"Glad to hear it," said Claudia. "As it happens, Harris has told me all about you.
and your childhood spent here at the Blue Ridge Mountains, in this marvellous cabin. It sounds like the both of you had an enviable childhood. I can't imagine waking up to those smouldering idyllic mountain views every day. You must have felt as if you'd died and gone to heaven. I know I would. It's spectacular around here."
"Well, we were blessed," admitted Winston, "and lucky because Dad was always at home working in his workshop. So we grew up with him always being around, and that was very good."
I watched my father as he tossed the French dressing into the salad and passed it around the table, then dished out large platefuls of his homemade lasagna. Over the years my father had become quite the accomplished cook, given he had raised me and my brother Winston without any female interferences.
"Oh, that's way too much, Mr. Ferris. I can only eat half of that,"
said Claudia, waving the helping my father had passed her away. My father did not hide the scowl that developed on his face.
"What? You're worried about ruining your figure, are you?"
he said scathingly.
"Oh, nothing like that," said Claudia. "I hope you don't think I'm terribly rude. I just don't have a really big appetite, that's all."
I was recoiling at my father's insults and unkind words, throwing him dagger-like looks across the table, as my dad did not appear to be taking any notice of me. His eyes were glued on my girlfriend, and his stare was intrusively invasive. Claudia began to fiddle awkwardly with her knife and fork, and her fingers trembled. She managed a half-hearted, rather watery smile as she looked up at my father.
"This looks great, Mr. Ferris. I understand from Harris here you are quite the cook."
I had judiciously warned Claudia that my father was so cynical of women, but I did not expect for a moment for him to be so blazingly rude towards Claudia. If he thought he was looking out for me as his son, he was grievously mistaken, because I was most affronted.
"Well, I enjoy cooking,"
said my father, mumbling under his breath. Claudia gushed, "Mr. Ferris, you are such a lucky person to live in such a lovely, delightful cabin like this. I can see why you live in this part of the world. As I was saying to your sons, well, I think the views are breathtakingly beautiful."
"I like it,"
said my father, shoving a large mouthful of lasagna into his mouth and chewing it vigorously.
"So tell me about yourself, Claudia. My son Harris here appears to be quite taken by you. This is the first time he's ever brought a girl home to the cabin for the weekend, so that is quite something."
"Oh, well, there's not much to really say about me. I grew up in a green leafy neighbourhood in Boston with 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Our family's all into medicine, but I'm more interested in doing psychology."
"So you're interested in the workings of the human mind? How interesting. How did you meet my son?"
"That's quite some story, actually. We first bumped into each other quite literally on the university campus. Both of us were carrying books in our hands. I dropped mine everywhere. He walked straight into me, your son. We both apologized to each other profusely. He helped me pick up some of my books. And then we just passed each other by. We didn't see each other again until he saw me in a bar in Boston. I tripped over the mat as I entered the bar in town. Your son was directly behind me, would you believe it? He helped me up to my feet and recognized me at once. It was quite romantic, actually. I think his first words to me were,
'Why do we keep bumping into each other like this? Methinks we're destined to meet before anything else untoward happens, and we end up throwing each other off our bicycles on the sidewalk. Let me buy you a drink.'
We got talking. The rest is history. We've been inseparable ever since."
"You were drinking, were you?"
my father asked Claudia accusingly.
"Do you often get inebriated?"
Claudia looked aghast by my father's suggestion. "No, I wasn't inebriated at all. Absolutely not, Mr. Ferris. If you must know, I'm not actually a big drinker. I didn't trip and fall because I was already drunk. Not so. The mat was not straight. It was rather buckled up. That's why I stumbled over it. I'm afraid I can be a bit of a klutz. I'm personally quite happy with 1 glass of wine. That's all I need. I'm not a big drinker."
"What about drugs? Have you taken any of those?"
"Dad," I said indignantly,
"You can't ask Claudia that." "Can't I just?" said my father. "Isn't it a fair question for me to ask? I like to think any young lady dating my son can give me a straight answer to a straight question. If I had girls, daughters instead of sons, I would be just as inquiring about the kind of young men they were dating. It's a reasonable question for me to ask, and I think I'm entitled to get an answer from Claudia. What do they say? If you have nothing to hide, you hide nothing.
Fair enough, Mr. Ferris. You make a good point there. But I assure you, I'm not going to be a bad influence on your son if that's what you think, and lead him down a wayward path. On the contrary, I'm unlikely to do that, if that's what you're suggesting. In truth, I'm rather boring and dull. What you see is what you get. I'm not sitting on some insidious dark secrets. If you want the truth, Mr. Ferris, I'll tell you it all. I've got nothing to hide. I'll put my cards on the table, shall I? I tried a magic mushroom once, Mr. Ferris. They're supposed to be hallucinogenic. And all I saw was monster spiders climbing up the wall. I was sure they were going to eat me up. It was a terrifying experience. Never again.
Well, why did you try it?
My father asked. That's a good question, Mr. Ferris. I wish I knew the answer to that. I was young and naive, I suppose. I buckled under the pressure. Everyone else was doing it. They were calling me straight-laced for not giving it a go, and a real party pooper.
A sure sign of weakness, said my father. Giving in to peer pressure. Why should you care what others think about you? You should stick firmly to your principles. That's what's wrong with this generation. People too weak to stand up for themselves, to fight for what's right. You should have said, I refuse to take drugs. It's against my principles, and I don't give a toss what you people think of me.
Claudia looked bewildered. She struggled to eat her food, as she continued fiddling with her knife and fork. I'm sorry, Mr. Ferris. I don't know what you want me to say. I'm not a smoker. I don't drink much, and I can assure you, I won't be trying drugs again. You're right. I should have stood up for myself and told them to take a running leap over a small pond. But I guess I just wanted to fit in. Now that I'm doing psychology, I do realise how pathetic it is to just follow the herd. It's so much better to stand up for one's beliefs, like you say, Mr. Ferris.
What about weed? Have you ever smoked it?
Claudia looked uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat. All right, I admit it. I tried it a couple of times, but it's not my thing. But even if it was, is it such a big deal, Mr. Ferris? It's legal in some places, and some people smoke it because it's medicinal, because they say it helps alleviate some of their ailments, aches in the body and stuff like that, and calm down nervous stress. So it's not all a bad thing,
You make a fair point, Claudia, said my father. So tell me, do you like children?
Claudia looked confused. The conversation had leapfrogged from drugs to children. Of course I like children, Mr. Ferris. That's a strange question to ask. What is all this about?
Just so you know, young lady, if you marry my son and ever abandon your children like my mother abandoned me and my sister, there will be hell to pay.
Look, Mr. Ferris, I'm dating your son. We're not getting married. We're having fun at the moment. One day I'd like to have kids, but I can assure you, I'd never dream of abandoning them. I'll be a good mother to them. I'm sorry what happened to you when you were young. Your son told me all about it. I don't blame you for being so cynical and scathing about women. As I was telling Harris, in your boots, I'd probably feel exactly the same as you do. But I assure you, not all women are made of the same fabric. Granted, I know some girls like that, who are only interested in themselves, and are probably the likely types to abandon their kids. But the vast majority of women, they're not like that. I just think you drew the short straw when it came to your mother, and I'm very sorry about that.
Not just my mother, my wife as well, said my father. Indeed, if you must know, my wife may have done considerably worse than just abandon her children. Much, much worse. What do you mean, Dad? My brother Winston asked incredulously. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Nothing, son. Nothing important. Believe me, it is better not to be enlightened about such things. Let's move on from here. Shall we move on to sunnier topics? I think that might be a good idea,
said Winston. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.